This is the real case of Ayla Reynolds, 2011, Maine, USA. Tell us in the comments which city and country you're watching from. It was supposed to be just another night, just another quiet evening in the small town of Waterville, Maine, a place where bad things weren't supposed to happen, where children played outside until the sun dipped below the trees, and families trusted one another. But on December 17, 2011, something unthinkable shattered that peace. A child vanished. Not a teenager, not someone who could run away. A baby, just 20 months old. Ayla Reynolds. Blonde curls, bright eyes, a giggle that lit up the room. She had only recently learned to walk. Her tiny steps still wobbly. Her favorite word was "Mama." And in the early morning hours of that freezing winter day, she simply ceased to exist. Her mother, Trista Reynolds, had last seen Ayla in October. She had checked herself into rehab, a temporary, painful decision made for the sake of her daughter's future. During that time, Ayla went to live with her father, Justin DiPietro, a man Trista barely knew, a man who had only recently been legally declared Ayla's father. It was meant to be temporary, just a few weeks, just until Trista could come back strong and sober. But by the time she returned, it was already too late. Justin claimed he put Ayla to bed around 8 p.m. that Friday night. She was wearing polka-dot pajamas and had a soft cast on her arm from a supposed accidental injury. A broken arm, he said, from a fall while playing. The next morning, he said she was gone. No broken window, no sign of forced entry, no sound. Just gone. Like smoke. Like a breath disappearing in the cold December air. The house was small and full. Not just with Justin and Ayla, but also with Justin's sister and his girlfriend. 3 adults, 1 baby, and not one of them claimed to hear or see a thing that night. Not a creak in the floorboards, not a door opening, not a whimper. Police were called around 8:51 a.m. The search began within minutes, but by then Ayla was already a ghost. Investigators swarmed the area. Search dogs, helicopters, rivers dredged, woods combed, flyers, news alerts. The story exploded. A baby missing from her own crib in the middle of the night. America was watching. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Fathers locked their doors. The world demanded answers. But what they got were lies, inconsistencies, half-truths. Justin's story didn't match what police were finding, or not finding. No evidence of an abduction. Blood found in the basement. Tiny drops, then more. Then enough to suggest Ayla had been seriously hurt. And yet, no arrest, no body, no closure, just silence. And in the middle of that silence was Trista, a mother broken open. She never stopped searching, never stopped speaking. She looked into every camera with the eyes of someone who had already buried her child in her heart, because she knew. She knew the truth was buried somewhere in that house, that someone was lying, that her baby didn't just vanish. The hours after Ayla Reynolds was reported missing turned into days, and the days into weeks, each one heavier than the last. The town of Waterville was no longer quiet. It buzzed with fear, frustration, and speculation. Missing posters clung to every telephone pole, fluttering in the icy wind. Volunteers walked miles through bitter snow, hoping to spot even the smallest piece of clothing, a toy, a footprint, anything that could mean she was still alive. But as each day passed without a single credible lead, the hope that had fueled the search began to crack under the weight of reality. Law enforcement quickly shifted their tone. They had seen child abduction cases before. They knew what to expect. Signs of forced entry, neighbors who heard screams, unfamiliar vehicles nearby. But this case didn't fit. The house at 29 Violette Avenue showed no evidence of a break-in. Nothing stolen, no strange fingerprints. Just the unsettling normalcy of a house where something terrible had happened behind closed doors. Then came the basement. The DiPietro house had a basement where Justin reportedly slept. Police conducted a forensic search and uncovered a chilling discovery: Ayla's blood. At first, investigators said it was a small amount. But as days passed and testing advanced, the truth was more disturbing. There was more blood than anyone was initially told. Traces were found on the floor, on items nearby, and even on a section of a wall. DNA confirmed it belonged to Ayla. It was no longer a question of whether she had been hurt. It was now a question of how badly. Still, Justin DiPietro didn't budge. He maintained his innocence in the face of growing suspicion. He told police he had no idea what happened to Ayla, that he put her to bed and woke to find her gone. But the public wasn't buying it. Neither were the investigators. They made a damning statement to the press. "We do not believe Ayla was abducted." With those words, the focus shifted entirely. This was no longer a missing persons case. It was potentially a homicide. But if it was a crime, where was the body? Justin refused to take a polygraph test, at least publicly. His sister, Alicia DiPietro, who was also home that night, gave little detail in her interviews. So did Courtney Roberts, Justin's girlfriend, who was staying in the house with her own child. 3 adults, 3 different stories. None of them aligned. The silence surrounding the truth only grew louder, and Trista Reynolds, Ayla's mother, was left to scream into that silence, pleading for justice, begging for someone to speak. There was also growing anger in the community. Candlelight vigils were held. Rallies demanded answers. Even former law enforcement officials began speaking out, frustrated by what they saw as a lack of action. People questioned how someone could walk away from such a case with no consequences. The public began to suspect what Trista already feared, that Ayla was gone, and the people who knew why were being protected by a system that lacked the proof to charge them. Then, in an act of devastating transparency, police revealed just how much blood had been found. It wasn't just a drop or two. It was enough to conclude that Ayla likely couldn't have survived the injuries that caused it. And still, no one was arrested. No one was named a suspect. The case was beginning to look like it would go cold, despite everything screaming that something monstrous had taken place in that house. And through it all, Ayla's crib sat empty, her toys untouched, her mother still searching, a community still in disbelief, and a baby still missing. By early 2012, the missing child posters that once hung fresh and hopeful had begun to fade. The tape that held them was brittle, the colors washed out by snow and sleet. But behind each one, Ayla Reynolds' face still stared back, wide-eyed, unaware, frozen in time. The little girl who disappeared into nothingness had become a symbol of something bigger, a failure of truth, of accountability, of justice. Trista Reynolds was no longer just a grieving mother. She had become a public voice for her daughter. She held press conferences. She stood in front of the house where Ayla disappeared and demanded the truth. She wore her daughter's name across her chest and carried her photos everywhere she went. Her grief had become activism. But it was a kind of activism no parent should ever have to learn. The kind that grows from sleepless nights, from guilt, from the ache of not knowing where your baby is or what was done to her. Still, the people inside that house remained silent. Justin DiPietro gave sparse statements through his lawyer. He claimed to be unfairly treated, to be the victim of public hatred, of a witch hunt. But what he never gave was clarity. He never gave details. He never gave the story that might help a grieving mother sleep at night. He never explained the blood. Public outrage continued to build. In May of 2012, it was revealed that not only was Ayla's blood found in the basement, but it had been discovered in several spots, including on a child's toy, a blanket, and even on a section of the concrete floor that had been soaked through. Investigators now believed that foul play was involved. But still, without a body, without a confession, without a single witness, there was no legal closure. Rumors ran wild. Some believed Ayla had died in the house accidentally, and the adults had panicked. Others were convinced there had been abuse, that the broken arm had never been properly explained, and that her final moments had been violent. But in the absence of hard evidence or a timeline, everything remained speculation. What haunted everyone, especially Trista, was the idea that Ayla's final hours might have been spent in pain, in fear, at the hands of people who were supposed to protect her. That summer, as the case dragged into its 7th month, Trista filed for custody again, a painful formality given the circumstances. She was no longer fighting for her daughter's return. She was fighting for legal recognition that Ayla should never have been with Justin in the first place. She wanted the courts to admit that a mistake had been made, that she had trusted the system, and the system had let Ayla down. But bureaucracy moved slowly. Investigations continued behind the scenes, and law enforcement remained tight-lipped. Publicly, there were no new leads, no arrests, and no answers. Behind closed doors, however, the case was anything but dormant. Investigators were gathering, comparing, building a timeline, a body of evidence, a case that might someday bring justice. But the clock was ticking. Memories fade, witnesses grow silent, and the longer the case remained open, the colder it seemed to become. Still, Trista kept speaking Ayla's name. She refused to let the world forget. And in doing so, she reminded everyone watching that this wasn't just a case. This was a child, a baby, a life that had been extinguished, but not yet accounted for. And the question still burned in every heart that had come to love Ayla through the headlines: how can a baby vanish and no one be held responsible? As 2013 arrived, more than a year had passed since Ayla Reynolds vanished. The snow had come again, covering Waterville in a blanket of white, erasing the footprints of those who still walked the woods looking for her. But nothing could erase what lingered in the minds of those who had followed the case. The image of a baby girl swallowed by shadows, and the haunting absence of truth. The investigation, though silent in the public eye, remained active. Behind closed doors, state police and the Maine Attorney General's office combed through every piece of evidence, every interview transcript, every digital footprint. But the challenge remained the same: building a case without a body. It was one of the cruel paradoxes of the justice system. Even when everything pointed to foul play, a missing body often meant no charges. Reasonable doubt had room to breathe. In the media, speculation had become a kind of echo chamber. Talk shows debated what really happened in that house. Online forums dissected statements and timelines like sacred texts. The public wasn't just watching the case, they were analyzing it. And everywhere, the question was the same: why hadn't anyone been arrested? Justin DiPietro had become a pariah. Hounded by reporters, he retreated from public life. When he did speak, it was calculated and minimal. Sound bites designed to deflect, not to reveal. He insisted he loved his daughter, that he had nothing to hide. But what he never offered was a version of events that made sense. Not to investigators, not to the public, and certainly not to Trista. Trista Reynolds, in contrast, remained unwavering. Her pain had not dulled. It had sharpened into something fierce, something determined. She continued to hold candlelight vigils, her voice trembling but resolute. She released new photos of Ayla to the media, smiling, playful, alive, desperate to keep her daughter's memory vibrant, not buried beneath suspicion and scandal. In the fall of 2013, Trista took a step that no mother should ever have to consider. She began speaking with legal counsel about the possibility of having Ayla legally declared dead. It was a choice born not of surrender, but of exhaustion, of needing a legal path forward. Without that declaration, she was caught in limbo. Ayla was missing, but there could be no justice, no closure, not even a gravestone. It was a decision that tore her apart, but the system left her no other door to knock on. Meanwhile, law enforcement released a quiet but critical update. They no longer believed that any abduction had occurred. They now believed that 3 adults in the house that night, Justin, his sister Elisha, and his girlfriend Courtney, knew more than they were admitting. But knowing wasn't proving, and without cooperation from any of them, the investigation remained stalled. For the public, frustration turned to fury. How could a child vanish under the care of 3 adults, and not a single one be charged with neglect, obstruction, or worse? How could a house filled with blood evidence not result in indictments? For Trista, the lack of accountability was more than a legal failure. It was a betrayal. Of Ayla. Of her. Of every parent who trusted that justice, at the very least, would not be silent. And still, the crib remained empty. The bedroom untouched. The bloodstains scrubbed away, but never erased. Somewhere in Maine, Ayla's story remained unfinished, and those who loved her most refused to let the silence win. By 2014, silence had become a second crime in the Ayla Reynolds case, and it was a crime no one seemed able to punish. 3 people had been in that house the night she vanished. 3 adults, and yet not one could, or would, offer an account of what happened to that child. Not one admitted hearing a cry, a thud, a door creak. Not one provided any evidence to point police in the right direction. It was as if a pact had been made, one that placed protection of the living above justice for the dead. The public's patience began to fray. News outlets revisited the story with increasing bitterness. Headlines no longer asked, "Where is Ayla?" They asked, "Why has no one been arrested?" Commentators spoke openly about what many were beginning to believe, that a child could die, and if the right people kept quiet long enough, the world would eventually move on. But Trista Reynolds refused to let that happen. By 2015, Trista had become a powerful voice not just for Ayla, but for other parents whose children were lost to violence, mystery, or systemic failure. She spoke at vigils, at rallies, at conferences. Her pain was raw, visible, and unfiltered. She talked about Ayla's laugh, her curls, the way she loved to dance. She talked about the blood in the basement, about the silence of the adults, about the system that required a corpse to recognize a crime. And then, in 2017, nearly 6 years after Ayla vanished, Trista made the hardest decision of her life. She petitioned the court to have her daughter legally declared dead. The hearing was somber, clinical, almost grotesque in its detachment. Legal declarations had to be made. Medical evidence presented. A judge had to look at photographs, autopsy-like reports built from blood evidence and investigative assumptions. It was not about memories. It was about facts, data, thresholds. And in May 2017, the ruling was issued. Ayla Reynolds was presumed dead. Cause: homicidal violence. There was no eulogy, no body to bury, no casket, just paperwork. But that paperwork gave Trista something powerful: standing. With Ayla legally declared deceased, Trista could finally take legal action against those she believed were responsible. And she did. In December 2018, she filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Justin DiPietro. It was not a criminal charge. It would not send him to prison. But it was a step toward accountability, toward the truth, toward forcing Justin into a courtroom to answer questions under oath, something the criminal system had not managed to achieve. The lawsuit alleged what many had long suspected, that Justin was responsible for Ayla's death, that he knew what happened to her, and that he had acted, or failed to act, in a way that led directly to her death and the concealment of her body. Justin, unsurprisingly, disappeared from public view. He was reportedly living out of state, avoiding service of court documents. It took months just to locate him. When he was finally served, he did not appear at hearings. He did not answer the lawsuit. He did not offer a defense. It was silence, again. But this time, silence would cost him. In 2019, A courtroom in Maine echoed with a verdict, not of guilt or innocence, but of accountability. Because Justin DiPietro never responded to the wrongful death lawsuit filed by Trista Reynolds, the court entered a default judgment in her favor. It was, legally speaking, an admission by absence. He had been given the opportunity to speak, to defend himself, to provide his side of the story under oath. He chose not to, and that silence, after nearly a decade of evasion, finally had a consequence. The judge ruled that the evidence presented was sufficient to conclude, under civil standards, that Ayla Reynolds had died as a result of Justin DiPietro's actions. He was held civilly liable for her wrongful death. But there was no handcuff, no mugshot, no cell door closing. Because civil liability isn't criminal justice. It can't imprison. It can't punish in the way people had hoped. It can only acknowledge. Still, for Trista, it was a kind of vindication, a declaration that someone, finally, had spoken the truth out loud in a courtroom, that her daughter's life and her death had not gone unnoticed by the law, that she had been failed by her father, by the adults in that house, by the silence that followed, and that the system now, at least in part, acknowledged that. But with the verdict came the same bitter question. Where was Ayla? No grave had been dug. No memorial stone had been placed. Ayla's remains had never been recovered. She was still out there, somewhere. In the woods, a river, a landfill, or hidden away intentionally, forever. And the people who knew where she was, if anyone still did, remained unmoved. No confession followed the judgment. No new evidence came to light. Justin DiPietro stayed silent, legally responsible, but personally and publicly unavailable. The cowardice, many believed, had calcified into cruelty. Trista's fight, however, didn't stop with the court. She turned the spotlight back on the investigators, back on the Attorney General's office, back on the system that had, in her eyes, hesitated too long, moved too slowly, and allowed a man to walk free despite overwhelming circumstantial evidence. She wanted criminal charges. She wanted handcuffs. She wanted the state to treat Ayla's case not as a cold one, but as a solvable one. One where there was blood, motive, timeline, and suspects. Her advocacy extended beyond her daughter. Trista began speaking for other parents whose children were missing, presumed dead, yet left without answers. She fought for legal reforms, changes in how missing children cases are prosecuted, especially when foul play is suspected, but no body is recovered. She became the mother who never stopped, not just in memory of her own daughter, but in the hope that no other parent would suffer what she had. The cruelty of silence. Still, there were nights when all of that advocacy melted away, and Trista was simply a mother who hadn't held her daughter in over a decade, who didn't know where her baby lay, who closed her eyes and saw blood on basement walls, and dreamed of a toddler's laughter fading into the cold night. Because civil judgment is not justice, and justice for Ayla Reynolds had yet to be delivered. As the 2020s began, nearly a decade had passed since Ayla Reynolds vanished from her crib in that modest house on Violette Avenue. Yet the case, like a wound never properly treated, refused to heal. In Waterville, the seasons continued to change, snow to thaw, leaves to fall. But time offered no peace, only more space for questions, for what-ifs, for grief. The house where Ayla disappeared was sold. A new family moved in, unaware, or perhaps unbothered, by its history. The walls had been painted over, the carpets changed. But the basement still existed, and so did the memories. For many in the town, that address would never be just another home. It was a symbol of a failure to protect, to prosecute, to explain. Meanwhile, Ayla's story became a cautionary tale whispered across parenting blogs, true crime podcasts, and candlelit Facebook pages. Her face, toddler round, eyes wide, frozen forever in time. became one of the most recognized missing child images in modern American history. And yet, her physical presence remained elusive. She existed now only in photos, in court records, in bloodstains logged into evidence, in the trembling voice of a mother who refused to stop. Every year, Trista Reynolds continued to organize vigils on the anniversary of Ayla's disappearance. She lit candles in the snow. She read poems, sometimes alone, sometimes surrounded by strangers who had come to know Ayla through the cold machinery of headlines and hashtags. They had never heard her laugh, never held her hand. But they remembered her. And remembering, in a case so defined by absence, had become a form of rebellion. Trista also continued to push for criminal charges. She met with state officials, gave interviews, and kept the pressure on. Her presence was unrelenting. Not because it was easy, but because she had no choice. "If I stop," she once said, "they win." And she disappears all over again. It was that fear that Ayla might be forgotten that haunted her more than anything else. The community echoed that urgency. Public trust in the investigation had eroded. People asked why, even after a civil judgment, no charges had been filed. The state insisted the case remained open, active, ongoing. But hope for a breakthrough was no longer rooted in forensic science or hidden evidence. It was rooted in conscience, in the hope that someone, anyone, would come forward. That guilt would crack the silence. That maybe, after all this time, the truth might still claw its way out of the dark. Over the years, anonymous tips continued to trickle in. A bone fragment found in a river. A plastic bag buried in the woods. Every time, Trista braced herself. And every time, the results came back inconclusive or unrelated. Hope, like grief, had become cyclical. It rose and crashed like the tide, cruel in its consistency. And yet, she endured. For those who followed the case, Ayla became more than just a missing child. She became a symbol of something deeper. The uncomfortable truth that in America, sometimes a baby can vanish, and even with blood on the floor and a name on a lawsuit, no one is punished. That justice, when denied long enough, starts to feel fictional. That silence can be more powerful than a scream. And in all of that silence, there is still a room, a small room, once filled with soft blankets, picture books, and lullabies. A room where Ayla Reynolds once slept, and from which she never emerged. By 2021, Trista Reynolds had become something more than a grieving mother in the eyes of the public. She had become a sentinel, standing watch over a memory the world might have tried to forget. Her life, like her daughter's, had been split in two. Before Ayla vanished, and everything after. She smiled sometimes in interviews, but it was the kind of smile that flickered. Brief, brittle, hiding the weight of a pain that never let go. Her apartment had become a shrine. Ayla's toys sat on a shelf, untouched. Her favorite stuffed animal, a worn-out pink bear, rested on a chair by the window. Photographs lined the walls, not just of Ayla, but of Ayla with Trista, frozen moments from a short life now stretched across eternity. In the corner was a box of court papers, police reports, and news clippings. Evidence of a war waged by a mother who refused to surrender. At night, Trista still dreamed, sometimes of Ayla laughing, playing, running toward her. Other times of darker things. Of Ayla calling for her in the dark, reaching out, and no one coming. She would wake up with her heart pounding, arms reaching instinctively for a child who wasn't there. Trauma had become ritual. Every morning was a reminder. Every year that passed, a betrayal of time. Despite everything, she remained vocal. She posted updates on social media. She pushed for reforms in missing children protocols. She organized fundraisers in Ayla's name, often donating the proceeds to other families with missing children. It gave her purpose, but it didn't heal. because healing requires resolution. And in Ayla's case, the wound was still wide open. There were moments when her advocacy felt like shouting into a void. The state continued to claim the case was open. Investigators insisted they were still working leads. But the silence, now more than a decade long, had begun to rot into something more painful: apathy. The story no longer dominated headlines. True crime audiences had moved on to fresher tragedies. And yet, Trista wouldn't. Justin DiPietro, too, had become a ghost. He no longer lived in Maine. Reports placed him in California, then Florida. He had not spoken publicly about Ayla in years. Not to defend himself, not to grieve, not to express remorse. Nothing. It was a silence so complete it bordered on cruelty. Some speculated he was protecting others. Some believed he feared the consequences of speaking. Others believed he simply didn't care. But Trista believed he knew. She was certain. And that belief burned inside her like a second heartbeat. She often said she didn't need a confession to know the truth. She saw it in the inconsistencies, in the lies, in the fear that came when justice came knocking, however softly. There was one interview years later where Trista sat quietly after being asked what she would say to Justin if he were in front of her. Her voice cracked, not with rage, but with fatigue. "Just tell me where she is," she said. "Tell me where you left her, so I can bring her home. That's all I want. That's all I've ever wanted. Because what do you do when justice refuses to speak? And the truth is buried beneath years of dust, doubt, and denial. What do you do when your baby's face becomes more familiar on missing posters than in memory? You keep asking. You keep showing up. You keep saying her name louder each year. Ayla Reynolds. Gone, but never forgotten." By 2023, Ayla Reynolds had become more than just a case file in Maine. Her name had woven itself into the national fabric of unresolved pain, joining the haunting list of children whose disappearances redefined how we talk about trust, custody, and justice. Ayla was no longer just a face on a poster. She was a question that refused to be answered. Documentaries began revisiting the story. True crime shows aired retrospectives, and investigative journalists retraced the timeline from the beginning. But every deep dive led to the same dark conclusion. Ayla did not vanish by accident, and someone in that house knew the truth. The evidence had never changed, only the attention it received. And while public interest would spike with each new documentary or anniversary, for Trista, interest wasn't enough. She didn't need attention. She needed resolution. In interviews, retired detectives spoke openly for the first time, expressing frustration, regret, and even guilt. Some said the system failed Ayla, that without a body, the legal threshold was too high to act, despite the blood evidence, despite the contradictions, despite the silence. Others admitted that fear of losing a high-profile trial may have stalled prosecutorial action. "There's a difference between knowing and proving," one said. And in Ayla's case, we knew. We just couldn't prove it. This gap, between knowing and proving, became the heart of Ayla's legacy. It raised questions about how the law handles missing persons, especially infants and toddlers who cannot defend themselves or testify. It exposed the fragility of systems meant to protect children. It revealed the brutal truth that without a body, even the most damning evidence can be met with hesitation. For child advocacy groups, Ayla became a rallying cry. Her case was cited in policy meetings and reform proposals. Efforts were made to expand no-body homicide legislation, laws that allow prosecution in cases where circumstantial evidence overwhelmingly suggests foul play. Some of those changes were slow. Others stalled. But Ayla's name was there, in the footnotes, in the speeches, in the bills. For Waterville, the town remained marked. New families moved in, businesses opened, but the shadow of 2011 never fully lifted. Locals remembered the helicopters, the search dogs, the reporters, the flyers stapled to every tree. And they remembered the house, small, unremarkable, where a child disappeared into thin air. It had become a place people avoided mentioning, but never forgot. And then there were the children who grew up with Ayla's story. Those who were 5 or 6 years old when it happened, now teenagers, who had seen her photo all their lives. They had never met her, but they knew her name. She was the girl who was taken, the girl no one ever found. For them, Ayla wasn't just a case, she was a warning. A sadness passed down like a family secret. And still, Trista fought on. Her strength had hardened, but not out of anger, out of devotion. She didn't speak about justice as punishment. She spoke of justice as peace. "I just want to know where she is," she said again and again. "I just want to bring her home. But Ayla remained somewhere in the in-between, between the justice system and the hearts of a community, between memory and evidence, between silence and a scream. More than a decade has passed since Ayla Reynolds disappeared, and yet the emptiness she left behind has only grown louder. In a world of breaking news and short attention spans, her story remains one of the few that refuses to fade. Not because of the media, not because of justice, but because of a mother who never let go. Because silence, when it surrounds the truth, becomes deafening. And Trista Reynolds has spent every year since 2011 tearing at that silence. One word, one vigil, one tear at a time. The crib is gone. The house has changed owners. The search parties have long disbanded. The blood has been cleaned. But nothing, not time, not distance, not apathy, has erased the truth that everyone feels in their bones. Ayla did not simply vanish. She was taken, lost, failed, and hidden. What remains now is the void. A child with no resting place, a case with no resolution, a justice system that demands more than it sometimes should. But within that void is also something enduring, a fierce, unbreakable love. Trista never turned Ayla into a symbol of pity. She turned her into a symbol of persistence. Every time she stood in front of a camera, every time she walked into a courtroom, every time she said her daughter's name into a microphone, she rebuilt what the world had tried to erase. And in doing so, she reminded us all, this is not just a true crime story. This is a life, a child, a daughter, a baby who liked to dance in pajamas, who had a broken arm that no one ever explained, who went to bed one night and never woke up. There's a cruelty in cases like Ayla's, a limbo of unknowing. It strips away ritual. There's no funeral, no goodbye, no grave to kneel at. Just birthdays missed, voices imagined, toys left behind, and a future that exists only in fragments of memory. Ayla would be a teenager now. Maybe she'd like music. Maybe she'd play sports. Maybe she'd still have those golden curls. But all of that was stolen. Not just from Trista, but from Ayla herself. And so, the fight continues. Not just for justice, but for truth. For a name that deserves more than to be followed by a question mark. For a child who should have been safe, and wasn't. For a country that must look harder at how it handles the voiceless. The babies who rely on adults not just for care, but for protection, for advocacy, for justice that does not expire. Ayla Reynolds may never be found. Her remains may stay hidden forever. But she has not vanished, not truly, because her name still echoes. In courtrooms, in legislation, in the hearts of strangers, and most of all, in the voice of the one person who will never stop saying it, her mother. And that voice, cracked, grieving, but unrelenting, may one day be the thing that finally brings the truth to light. Until then, we remember Ayla. We speak her name. We wait for justice.